The Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on assessing the Homeland security impacts of a changing climate. So good afternoon. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today to discuss this incredibly important topic. I'm especially glad that the subcommittee hearing is leading the Committee on Homeland Security's efforts on climate change this Congress. The last time this committee held a noticed activity on climate change, it was in 2015 when the Republicans held a hearing entitled Examining DHS Misplaced Focus on Climate Change. Let me be clear. Climate change is here, it's happening, and the scientific evidence is there, and it is a threat to our security. If continued unchecked, the effects of climate change will have a devastating impact on nearly every aspect of American life. Scientists from all over the world are clear. If we do not start taking steps to address this issue, it will soon be too late. As climate change continues to make extreme weather events worse, our critical infrastructure will be at risk of failing, a terrifying prospect from our homeland security. That risk is increasing, according to researchers at the RAND Corporation, as we see stronger disasters and underinvestment in resiliency. It is not just infrastructure, but it's also healthcare systems, food production, military installations, commerce, and so much more that are at risk. All things that are critical to our homeland security. With the FEMA workforce already stretched thin to adequately respond to current disasters, there are serious questions as to how they will be able to respond as climate change intensifies, hurricanes and other disasters. However, instead of us trying to incorporate climate change in how it plans for the future, FEMA has stripped any mention of it from their 2018 to 2022 strategic plan, which guides the agency's actions over the next few years. But you don't have to look far for the future to see how climate change is affecting us. It's no coincidence that 18 of the 19 warmest years on record have occurred since 2001. The world is getting warmer, and that's a fact. Or take, for instance, Hurricane Harvey, one of the most devastating storms in recent history. Studies have shown that the rainfall during Hurricane Harvey, which was over 60 inches, was as much as 38% higher than would be expected in a world without climate change. This isn't some far-off phenomenon. This is affecting real people right now. The thousands of residents in and around Houston who dealt with flooding and whose lives are still being put back together. In my own home state of New Jersey, we are seeing some of the most intense warming trends in our country. In an analysis of data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, New Jersey is one of the top 3 fastest warming states in the country. Yet despite these dire warnings, the federal government is doing nothing to try to stop the effects of climate change. In fact, it is making the problem worse by rolling back rules and regulations aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and rolling back smart building rules to protect infrastructure from floods. And despite controlling the House for the past 8 years, Republicans in Congress did nothing to address what scientists agree will be the devastating effects of climate change. Today, we have an expert panel of witnesses that can discuss the science of climate change, why it matters to our homeland security, and the effects on children who are particularly vulnerable population when faced with extreme weather events. I look forward to hearing their views on this topic. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. King, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I regret that I got here late. It was over in the House floor, and there was sort of a mix-up on when the votes were going to stop. In any event, I appreciate you having this hearing, and bottom line is, from the wildfires on the West Coast and tornadoes in the South to the hurricanes along the eastern seaboard of the United States, no area of the country is immune to the devastating effects of natural disasters. But pre-disaster mitigation has the potential to limit the negative effects of natural disasters. These pre-disaster mitigation efforts by policymakers, individuals, first responders, and emergency preparedness professionals must ensure that no geographic region of the country is left unsupported. Mitigation activities include upgrading and strengthening existing structures from all hazards, identifying sustainable flood and erosion control projects, purchasing hurricane shutters to resist wind, and managing vegetation to reduce potential fire fuel. The FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program helps communities implement hazard mitigation measures following a presidential major disaster declaration to reduce the risk of loss of life and property from future disasters. To receive funds through this grant program, FEMA requires each state complete a state hazard mitigation plan. New York's 2019 State Hazard Mitigation Plan highlights 5 goals and objectives to include coordination between federal, state, and local entities, protection of existing properties, increasing awareness of hazard risk and mitigation capabilities among stakeholders, citizens, and elected officials alike, preserving or restoring the functions of natural systems, and to build stronger infrastructure. Not only do mitigation activities aim to reduce deaths, injuries, and property damage, they also have the potential to limit the economic impact of disaster recovery efforts. A recent report by the National Institute of Building Sciences found that by designing buildings to meet 2018 building code standards, the national mitigation benefit-cost ratio is $6 to 1 invested for floods, and 10 to 1 invested for hurricanes, and 12 to 1 invested for earthquakes. The report also found that impacts of 23 years of federal mitigation grants provided by FEMA, the Economic Development Administration, and HUD result in a national benefit of 6 to 1 invested. Fortunately, our focus on emergency preparedness oftentimes occurs in the aftermath of a natural disaster, which is too late. However, as we've hardened our defenses preemptively in the event of a terrorist attack, we also must be prepared for the devastation of a severe weather event. The reality is that national disasters will continue to occur, and we should use every disaster as an opportunity to learn and improve our mitigation capabilities to decrease the loss of life and damage to our homes and infrastructure. I would also say, Mr. Chairman, though, that I would hope that as we go forward on this, that we focus on what can be done as far as mitigation, rather than get into a debate over climate control. And I'm not disputing with anything that you've said, but this committee was established back in 2001, 2002, 2003, because of the attacks at 9/11. There are any number of other committees in the House that do deal with natural disasters, do deal with climate control. And while we have a role to play, I would say I don't want us to go too far afield in that. We have a hard enough time coordinating our efforts against terrorism. We always say that other committees are cutting into our turf. We've always said that there should be a focus with our committee on counterterrorism and terrorism, and that can be obviously expanded to white supremacist groups here in the country, but it's geared toward violence, toward acts of violence and acts of terrorism. And if we focus our efforts going beyond what I believe is the role of Homeland Security in meeting these natural disasters, then I think we are diluting our efforts and really undercutting the purpose of why this committee was formed back in 2000, I guess it was 2003, before it actually came into effect. So with that, I commend you for holding the hearing today, but I do hope that as we go forward, we realize that our main goal as a committee, our main purpose from the genesis was to focus on terrorism, and I realize that has been expanded now, which I understand. I support that, but I think we should leave the debate over climate control and global warming to other committees. We can, let's just say, accept for the purpose of the argument that everything is true, and then we should focus on what the mitigation should be rather than getting into debates on how to change the climate, or prevent climate change. With that, I yield back, and I also look forward to the testimony of all the witnesses, and I appreciate them taking the time to be here today. Yield back.
Well, I'd like to thank the gentleman, and it's duly noted. I respect your concern in that area, and we'll continue to try to work towards our goal, which is to keep the country safe.
Mr. Chairman, I have no doubt of your dedication. Believe me, I want that on the record clear today.
Thank you. Yours as well. Okay. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Our panel, I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Dr. Astrid Caldas. I'm sorry, did a job on that one, didn't I? Is a senior climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Next, we have Mr. Tim Manning, a former deputy administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and currently a senior advisor to the Pacific Disaster Center and president and CEO of Berglund Manning, LC. Next, we have Ms. Christy Truesdale, is the deputy director of Children's Environmental Network. Lastly, we have Chief Dan Eagleson, who is the president and chairman of the board for the International Association of Fire Chiefs. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Dr. Caldas. Say it for me one time. Say your name for me one time.
Astrid Caldas.
Astrid Caldas.
Thank you.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Payne, Ranking Member King, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify about climate change science and impacts. I'm Astrid Caldas, a senior climate scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I will focus on general impacts and not on the military. The sources for all information are in my submitted written testimony. 18 of the 19 warmest years since record-keeping began have occurred since 2001, meaning high school graduates from the class of 2019 have lived their whole lives in a world of record-breaking temperatures. The last 5 years have been the 5 hottest of all. There is strong consensus among the scientific community that global warming and climate change have been happening for decades, are caused by humans through the emission of carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels, and that the need for emissions reductions is urgent to avoid the worst consequences. 2 recent scientific assessment reports state that millions of people, including here in the United States, are already being affected by worsened heat, drought, wildfires, flooding from extreme precipitation and sea level rise, and stronger hurricanes. And economic impacts are staggering. The past 3 years have been 3 of the 4 costliest years for climate-related disasters in the US. Climate change is expected to make these disasters worse unless we put all our might into reducing heat-trapping emissions. There were 13 extreme rain events in the US between May 2015 and June 2018, even though such events had historically a probability of 0.2% of occurring in any one year. The type of devastating rain that fell in Louisiana in 2016 is expected to occur 40% more often and be 10% more intense now than it was before global warming. Extreme rain events have become more frequent and more intense, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. With more extreme rain, flood frequency has increased in the Mississippi River Valley and across the Midwest over the last century. Eastern Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey have also experienced an increase in flood frequency over the last 50 years. There has been an increase in intensity of hurricanes since 1970. A warmer sea surface and higher humidity in the air provide fuel to stronger hurricanes, the latter increasing the amount of rain they bring. The record-breaking rainfall from Hurricane Harvey was about 3 times more likely and 15 to 38% more intense because of global warming. Storm surge is riding on higher seas, and the area flooded by Hurricane Sandy was about 27 square miles larger than it would have been in 1880, when seas were 8 inches lower. Heat records are being broken much faster than cold records, with California experiencing record-breaking heat waves in 2017 and 2018. Global warming has contributed to the severity and probability of about 80% of record hot days globally since the mid-20th century. Droughts are now occurring at higher temperatures. The flow of the Colorado River has been reduced, and multi-year droughts have led to massive agricultural losses in both California and Texas. Warming temperatures and drier soils have contributed to increases in area burned, number of large wildfires, and wildfire season length. The area burned in the western US between 1984 and 2015 was twice what it would have been without climate change. The Tubbs Fire in 2017 was the most destructive in California history until the Camp Fire of 2018 surpassed it. Finally, climate change can exacerbate historical inequities. Socioeconomically vulnerable segments of the population face big challenges recovering from disasters due to lack of resources and historic disenfranchising. These communities are often located in riskier areas such as the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, which flooded heavily during Hurricane Katrina, or can't access resources necessary for recovery, such as in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Ignoring climate change will not make it go away or lessen its impacts. Investing in climate preparedness will help reduce future costs of climate impacts, and cutting global warming emissions will help limit the magnitude of those impacts. Only action can make it less damaging to our lives, our health, economy, and planet. Thank you.
And the votes have just been called, so the committee will stand in recess to allow members to vote on the floor. The committee will reconvene 15 minutes after the conclusion of the last vote in this series of votes on the floor. So for right now, we're in recess. Committee will come to order. I believe the next we have Mr. Tim Manning, former Deputy Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and currently a Senior Advisor to the Pacific Disaster Center and the President and CEO of Berglund Manning LC. Mr. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Payne, Ranking Member King, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon on the impact of a changing climate on disasters. I'm Tim Manning, former Deputy Administrator of FEMA for Protection and National Preparedness, currently serving as a consultant and university lecturer in disaster and emergency management and global resilience. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you on this critical topic today. Disasters are increasing with frequency and impact worldwide. 2018 saw the fourth highest number of billion-dollar disasters, only behind 2017, 2016, and 2011. The American disaster preparedness and response community has made and continues to make enormous strides in its ability to prepare our communities for the risks and hazards with which they are faced. Disaster management plans, strategy, staffing, response, they're all based in an assessment of potential future crises that is, in most cases, rooted and calibrated against an understanding of the hazards and disasters of the past. My great concern and consideration of the rapidly changing climate is that we may be significantly underestimating the risks and hazards with which we are faced and the readiness of emergency management agencies to respond. And without an overt and concerted effort to account for the impacts of climate change, FEMA and the American emergency management community will not be fully prepared to protect, mitigate, and respond to the threats facing the nation. We know a changing climate makes disasters worse. More frequent, more intense storms, often in places unaccustomed to such events, impacting infrastructure, exacerbating flooding, and even expanding the spread of mosquito and other insect-borne diseases. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture and results in significantly heavier rainfall in shorter periods of time. Heavy precipitation events in the Midwest and Northeast in particular have increased by up to 50% since 1900, and may increase as much as another 50% over the next 50 years. With this increase in heat retention comes warmer oceans and the potential for stronger, more intense coastal storms, including in areas unaccustomed to such events. Shifting temperatures result in shifting weather patterns in the interior, potentially resulting in greater or less snowfall in areas, changing the spring flood risk, and other impacts. Rising sea levels raise the base on which storm surge and tsunamis ride, greatly increasing the potential inundation of areas, as well as bringing frequent non-storm blue sky or clear sky flooding to American cities such as Charleston, Annapolis, Maryland, and New York City. Changing weather patterns affect wildfire risk as well. According to analysis by the National Research Council, we've experienced an extension of the western fire season of more than 2 months in a year. The average size of wildfires has increased by 300%. While many attempts to address the impacts of climate change have been made in recent years, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, in your opening remarks, the word climate does not occur once in the current 2018 to 22 FEMA strategic plan. One argument is that the general philosophical approach to emergency management and all hazards preparedness, in which agencies prepare for any hazard, accounts for any potential changes from climate. But that belies the reality. Staffing, budgeting, the number and scale of response teams, equipment, pre-positioning, even response planning assumptions are all based on an assessment of what worked or didn't in previous disasters. And underestimating the severity, frequency, or possible location of disasters will result in organizations under-resourced for the mission at hand. The strategic objectives of FEMA are laudable. In their strategic plan, the goal of quadrupling the investment in mitigation is an ambitious and potentially very valuable effort. However, if this investment is made against a base flood elevation model that does not account for rising sea levels and increased rainfall intensity, it can likely lead to poor decisions and wasted money and effort. In 2015, President Obama issued Executive Order 13690, which among other things established a federal flood standard in recognition of rising sea level and climate change of an additional 2 to 3 feet of freeboard for federally funded projects, including hazard mitigation. However, in August of 2017, President Trump rescinded that order. FEMA and the emergency management community is not likely to be right-sized or positioned for its potential disaster mission without accounting for a likely future that is very different from its recent past. The international community recognized this with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, to which the United States is a signatory, by calling on nations to, quote, prepare or review and periodically update disaster preparedness and contingency policies, plans, and programs, considering climate change scenarios and their impact on disaster risk, close quote. We should adopt this approach as well. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the opportunity to discuss the impact of climate change on disasters and the emergency management community in the United States, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. Ms. Christy Truesdale is the Deputy Director for Children's Environmental Network, and we would, at this time, hear your summary of your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Payne, Ranking Member King, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It is an honor to testify before you today. Our children are our most valuable resources. They represent the future of our nation. Yet 1 in 4 students in the U.S. has a chronic condition. Many of the childhood diseases and developmental disabilities that have been increasing over the past 40 years are environmentally mediated. Children are more vulnerable than adults to environmental hazards because of their unique physiological and behavioral traits, and because their bodies are still developing. The youngest children are not aware of environmental risks, and they lack the knowledge, resources, and power to address them. Climate change heightens these risks, especially for children from communities of color and lower income. Droughts, wildfires, and extreme heat events are increasing in frequency and intensity. Hurricanes and flooding are increasing in severity, and patterns of infectious disease are changing. Pediatricians in the United States report that they are already seeing the serious effects of climate change on children's health. We know that young children are among those most at risk from physical injuries and death resulting from wildfires and weather disasters. They are dependent on caregivers and may lack the knowledge, mobility, and communication skills to keep safe. Disasters can also cut off access to medical care, compounding the risks to injured children as well as to those with pre-existing conditions. Extreme weather disasters also affect children's mental health. Children exposed to Hurricane Katrina were 5 times as likely as pre-Katrina cohorts to have serious emotional issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. For many of the most vulnerable children, these issues persist and adversely affect the trajectory of their lives. Heat waves are projected to increase in frequency and intensity. Research has associated low birth weights, premature birth, and congenital heart defects with maternal exposure to extreme heat. Young children are also more vulnerable to heat-related illness, and student athletes are at the greatest risk from exertional heat stroke. Climate change is degrading our air quality. Approximately 10% of children aged 5 to 19 in the US suffer from asthma. Increased levels of ground-level ozone, particulate matter, and pollen due to warmer temperatures, increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, and more frequent, intense, and long-lasting wildfires exacerbate asthma symptoms. Inhalation of particulate matter also affects unborn children by increasing the risk for premature births and lower birth weights. Infectious disease risks, such as foodborne and waterborne illnesses, increase with climate change. Access to safe drinking water is critical. Children drink more proportionately than adults, and because their immune systems are still developing, they can have more pronounced responses to infections. In addition, the changing climate can create conditions favorable for the spread of vector-borne diseases, such as Lyme disease and Zika. In the US, young boys are among those most at risk of contracting Lyme disease, and children born to women infected with the Zika virus are at risk for microcephaly, brain damage, and other birth defects. Over 13 million children in the US live in food-insecure households, and disasters exacerbate this as families face food spoilage, employment instability, and disrupted food systems. Also, many families rely on the free or reduced breakfasts and lunches offered through schools to help ensure their children are fed. When disasters strike, children, however, are unable to attend school, some of them for weeks. Indeed, schools and childcare programs are important settings for the approximately 65 million American children who attend them and for their communities. Yet there is no federal oversight for the protection of their environmental health in these settings. Many facilities are old, contain hazardous building materials, and are in poor condition, and many are located on or near hazardous sites. These risks can be amplified in disasters, and many schools and child care providers lack the resources, capacity, and knowledge to address them. Climate change makes children's environmental health and issues of health disparities more visible than ever. I urge the subcommittee to consider children's unique vulnerabilities in all environmental decisions and policies within its jurisdiction, providing special consideration of those children who are most vulnerable. This is our moral imperative, and it's an investment in the stability and security of our country. Thank you for your leadership and for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee.
Thank you, Ms. Truesdale. See, now we will have recognized Chief Eagleson to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Payne, Ranking Members King, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Dan Eggleson, and I'm the Chief of Albemarle County, Virginia Department of Fire Rescue. I'm also the President and Chairman of the Board of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, who I'm representing today. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. No matter if it's a hurricane, tornado, flood, or wildland fire, America's local fire departments are the first to arrive on scene and often the last to leave. For the critical first 24 hours, local fire departments must provide emergency response in treacherous conditions without expectation of immediate state or federal assistance. In short, local fire departments, large and small, are all hazard responders responsible for meeting these great challenges. The cost and intensity of climate-related disasters are increasing. According to NOAA, the U.S. has witnessed 14 or more weather-related disasters costing more than $1 billion each year for the past 3 years. In addition, we've seen a number of acres burned by wildland fires increase by 2/3 over the past 10 years to 8.8 million acres. In addition to property loss, these disasters are causing tragic losses. According to NOAA, the 14 weather-related disasters in 2018 costing more than $1 billion in damages, caused 247 deaths. According to NFPA, 44 firefighters were fatally injured between 2007 and 2016 as a result of wildland fires. An additional 1,330 fireground injuries were caused by wildland fires between 2011 and 2015. Congress should take the following 3 steps to help local communities and fire departments prepare to increase number of climate-related disasters. Number 1, continue to promote mitigation efforts. The IFC thanks Congress for passing and President Trump for signing the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. This legislation promoted both pre-disaster and post-disaster mitigation activities. It also focused on the importance of state and local adoption of model commercial and residential building codes. The NIBS released a study earlier this year demonstrating that the adoption of the model building codes generates a national benefit of $11 for $1 invested. Furthermore, the adoption of wildland fire codes provides a benefit of $4 for every $1 invested. We urge Congress to prioritize the use of federal funds for building and rebuilding structures in communities that meet this consensus-based code. Number 2, support community preparedness programs. The IFC recommends that communities assess the risk of floods, windstorms, and wildland fires. In order to prepare for these disasters, the whole community must be engaged, from federal and state officials to local homeowners. Programs like the IFC's Ready, Set, Go program help local homeowners take steps to make their homes fire safe, prepare for the event of a wildland fire, and evacuate quickly when fire threatens. We have seen examples, including the state of New Jersey, where planning for wildland fires can be utilized to help communities evacuate from other natural disasters. We ask the Congress to continue to fund community preparedness programs at FEMA and the U.S. Forest Service. And finally, number 3, support programs that prepare local fire departments to respond to climate-related disasters. A well-prepared fire department is best prepared to handle a major disaster. Leadership programs at the U.S. Fire Administration and National Fire Academy help fire service leaders identify and prepare for all hazard risks to their communities. As disasters increase in intensity, they draw in resources from around the nation through EMAC and other mutual aid agreements. It is important that local fire departments have the necessary training, equipment, and staffing to respond to local and regional and national disasters. The Fire and Safer grant programs provide matching grants to local fire departments to to meet these needs. The U.S. Forest Service's state and volunteer fire assistance programs provide links between federal and state authorities and local fire departments to prepare for wildland fires. When disasters strike, the nation's urban search and rescue teams, hosted by local fire departments, provide life-saving capabilities. We ask that Congress reject proposed cuts to these programs and adequately fund them. We also ask Congress to support nationwide mutual aid systems like EMAC and NMAS. As the risk from climate-related events increases, the nation must take steps to mitigate, respond, and recover from them. The federal government is working with partners like the IFC to prepare for these events. We ask that Congress continue to support these efforts to keep Americans and our firefighters safe. Thank you again, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Chief. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I'll remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. Okay. Dr. Caldas, what do you think is the most dangerous part of this administration's anti-science agenda?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that there are several aspects of the anti-science agenda that are not in the best interest of the American people. Sidelining expertise and independent scientific advice is one of them. Reducing access, public access to science, government science and government scientific reports, and also compromising public protections. And that is because by doing these things, they are preventing scientists from bringing the information to the public. They are preventing scientists from talking about their own science to the media and communicating it in a relevant way for the public and for policymakers. They are compromising protections, air quality protections, environmental protections, pollution protections that are not in the best interest of the American people. They are also reducing, they are also stopping and compromising the public advisory, scientific advisory committees. Mm-hmm. They are compromising or closing, shutting them down altogether. They are keeping scientific advisory positions not filled, they are vacant. Yeah. So all of this is not bringing science into policymaking. And all of these things together are not in the best interest of the American people and of the environment.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it appears that this administration really enjoys having many positions now we're finding at DHS, acting FEMA director, acting Secretary of Homeland, acting, everyone's acting. You know, it really causes a problem. Mr. Manning, I'm very worried about the Trump administration's decision to roll back the rules that would require all infrastructure projects receiving federal dollars to be built to flood-resistant standards. Can you discuss some of the future risks now that the federal government has abandoned this resilient building proposal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I share your concern with the revocation of those requirements. The executive order, the previous requirements on infrastructure investment was a 2-foot additional elevation above base flood elevation. You may all be familiar with the flood maps, flood zones. And for critical activities, things like critical infrastructure, firehouses, command centers, an additional 3 feet. What we've seen, those were based on the IPCC most conservative guidelines of a 2-foot rise in sea level over the next 50 years. I think most people, and I would defer actually to my colleague to the right here, accept that that's an overly conservative estimate, that it's probably going to be closer to 4 or more feet over the next 50 to 100 years. sea level rise. The base flood elevations as they are also don't account for severe rainfall. So we are making all of the mitigation investments that we make, all of the public infrastructure investments we make as a nation could potentially be at risk if we are building in low-lying elevations. We see repeatedly things like wastewater systems that don't function because of rising sea level, making the drainage systems not work. We make investments in critical infrastructure facilities at places that will flood repeatedly. And as it is today, we see in Annapolis, Maryland, right outside the Naval Academy, floods frequently with no rainfall, just because of rising sea levels in the Chesapeake. A restoration of some restrictions, some additional free board in order to receive and spend federal dollars in public infrastructure is an absolutely critical and wise decision into the future for us.
Thank you, sir. I'll now let the ranking member have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Eagleson, thank you for your testimony. Thanks for being here today. In your testimony, you discussed the importance of community preparedness. Now, as far as I know, in New York City, and the suburbs, they are pretty much on that, and they are actively engaged. But what can the federal government do to continue to work with and encourage communities across the country to achieve a culture of preparedness, especially in a community that hasn't been hit yet, and they just think it's somebody else's problem?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think we have a lot going on right now in terms of partnerships like with the IFC and FEMA, programs in place. Our point and our ask at this point is to continue to fund those programs, encourage communities to reach out and engage. Our communities are constantly changing. Education requirements are constantly evolving, so it's an ever-going process. But at the local level, I can tell you that we need some help in terms of funding to continue those programs into the future. But education is the key to help build a resilient community. Our process right now is unsustainable in terms of our response. We have to build a more resilient and prepared community.
Along those levels then of funding, one area, among others, that the chairman and I would agree on is on the fire grants, SAFER grants. In fact, I guess beginning in the last year of the Obama administration, unfortunately all 3 years of the Trump administration, their budget has called for really radical, severe cuts in those grants. In the past 3 times, Congress has overcome that. Hopefully we'll do it again. I think there is bipartisan support for those grants. But apart from the actual political benefit or the popular benefit of those grants, can you give some detail as to how the money is spent, why it's important, why it's not just another level of spending?
Certainly.
I'm on your side on this, so I'm giving you the opening there.
I can speak from my local department in that we were a recipient of both a SAFER and an AFG grant. A SAFER grant allowed us to hire early non-firefighters to kickstart a new station for our community that helped us lower our ISO rating, which provided benefits in terms of insurance savings to our citizens, but it also provided a much-needed protection to a very vulnerable population. We also were able to take advantage of an AFG grant to target a vulnerable population, those who live below the level of poverty in the southern part of our county, to go in and educate the community and install smoke detectors and have a conversation about how to reduce risk. So those are 2 real good examples of recent activities just in Albemarle County of how we benefit from those very valuable grants. And I appreciate your support on those.
Thank you. Not in a political sense, but in a very effective governmental lobbying sense. Does the International Association of Chiefs intend to take a stand on this and be aggressive, contacting local members of Congress, contacting the administration on this?
We do. We constantly encourage our members to reach out and engage with their elected officials to support the AFG and SAFER grants and all mitigation grants. We're actively involved in promoting any kind of mitigation activities to help us address this problem, an all-hazard problem, quite frankly.
Well, thank you for your service, and thank you for cementing the relationship between me and the chairman here today. So thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Next, we'll hear from the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member, and I want to thank our expert panelists for their testimony here today. The House has a responsibility to speak out and take action on climate change and its impact to Homeland Security. I think it can't be minimized. FEMA has a very huge mammoth task ahead of it itself, and particularly when we're talking about emergency preparedness. We know that there are going to be multiple events. We have some still going on right now in the United States of America. And I think it's critical that we look at this from a migration standpoint. There will be a point where people are unable to live in their communities if we don't begin mitigating the effects of climate change, and we'll have to move to other parts of the country in order just to survive. So I want to politely disagree with my colleague, Mr. King, who kind of indicated that there is another area of jurisdiction that should be looking at this issue. I think we need an all hands on deck, quite frankly, approach to what we know is already an issue for the American people. And when we hear the president say climate change is fake news, one wonders whether he also believes that the earth is still flat, or that the earth is flat. Because denying the reality that greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to rising seas and extreme temperatures flies in the face of what we're experiencing, of the science. Within the scientific community, the debate has already been settled. So today's hearing is about recognizing that climate change is not only an environmental threat, but it's a threat to Homeland Security, and it's an existential threat to human life. Rising seas, flooding neighborhoods, they're also threaten critical infrastructure. So when farmers' fields run dry from prolonged drought, it creates a humanitarian crisis of hunger and despair, the seeds from which terrorism can emerge. And we've seen this in other parts of the world. So we're not stretching here to have this hearing today. Last week, as Vice Chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I was proud to mark up a bill, and I'm an original co-sponsor of the Climate Action Now Act, which seeks to reverse the logical withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. The environmental costs of climate change are reason enough to take hold, to be bold and take international action. The Homeland Security implications that we are discussing today only further reinforce the need to reduce carbon emissions and embrace green technologies before it's too late. My question, Mr. Manning, is on FEMA's capacity. We've seen some of the worst disaster in the previous few years, and FEMA, frankly, has seemed stretched too thin to adequately respond in all cases. Can you discuss some of the impacts to the agency and its workforce if we don't get serious about incorporating efforts to mitigate climate change into our federal policy?
Thank you, Congresswoman. That's a wonderful and very on-point question. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, does all of its budgeting, planning, and staffing based on an analysis of what they expect basically the next fiscal year's worth of disasters to look like. The planning goes out obviously much longer than a fiscal year, but from a budgeting perspective, how many people work at FEMA, what's the staffing look like, is all based on the fiscal years. And I look backwards at disasters. Not unlike the way the Department of Defense has a two-theater approach to its strategic mission load, FEMA does the same with 2 Type 1 disasters happening in 2 parts of the country at the same time. Those are defined roughly as the things that it's experienced in the past. The concerns with not explicitly and overtly addressing the changes from a changing climate on the face of those disasters are that we'll see, in combination with a migration of people to coasts and urbanization, we'll see much larger disasters. We are already seeing much more intense hurricanes, much more heavy rainfall, and much more widespread flooding. If the disasters that we see are run-of-the-mill, quote-unquote, run-of-the-mill disasters are that much worse, and our catastrophic disasters are that much worse, FEMA won't be positioned correctly with budgeting and resourcing and manpower to be able to deal with that. The planning assumptions on how the federal government organizes support states will also be insufficient because it'll be based on 2 not severe enough of storms and disasters into the future.
I know. Can you say Puerto Rico? With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for appearing as well. Mr. Chairman, I have great respect for first responders, firefighters, peace officers, people who rush in when others are rushing out. And because I have such respect for them, I'm curious about the esprit de corps, the morale, when we have fires in the West and they're consuming not only property, but in many cases people. And the firefighters are there risking their lives. And we have a commander-in-chief who seems to say things that are antithetical to what they're doing. How does this impact the morale, the esprit de corps?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. Firefighters are very task-oriented and mission-focused, and so I think, while I can't speak for the firefighters who are on the front line, I think that they were focused on protecting their communities because they have a love for the job and a love for their service and a love for their fellow citizens. And I think that's what motivates our firefighters. Of course, I'm sitting here thinking that we always need to continue to support our first responders, firefighters, police officers, and EMS workers at all costs because they're the ones that have to deal with all kinds of everyday disasters, including the large fires that we've seen out in California. So I'd say we do that through recognition and support through federal, state, and local funding is probably our best bet. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let's talk about chemical plants. In Houston, Texas, we have a large concentration of chemical facilities. And we recently had an event, and there was a requirement that persons shelter in place. Shelter in place. Benzene was one of the chemicals that persons were exposed to. We have, as I understand it, a requirement that if a Coast Guard person is exposed to benzene in an amount considered dangerous because it's a carcinogen, that we have to monitor that person for the rest of his life. Check to make sure he's okay or she's okay. I don't know that we have similar regulations, requirements, rules for firefighters who are equally as exposed. Do you have any intelligence that you can share with me on this question?
Yes, sir. I'm involved heavily in the fire service in terms of cancer research, and the IFC supports the adoption of an annual physical for all firefighters, which includes screening for such cancers. Firefighters are almost twice as likely to get cancer than the average citizen, so we're very much focused on cancer prevention and screening and do support an annual physical so that we can keep firefighters' health and safe and on the job. In terms of working with industry, we promote fire departments reaching out and engaging with local industry through their LEPCs to plan for in the event of an issue at these localities, these plants, to plan long before the event, to make those arrangements and those relationships ahead of time and understand what the hazards to the citizens are. I just spoke last week about a similar subject. And so I think it's really important to pre-plan those and engage with the local industry and have a unified approach to any emergency. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question may be a little bit off subject in the sense that this should relate more to first responders, in my opinion, and persons who are helping us, but there was a mention of children and how they're impacted by this. And when you hear the call shelter in place and your child is away from you at school, can you give me some sense of what the school of the future should look like such that children will be able to properly shelter in place? Anyone?
I think it's important to focus on any future building codes that may build a more resilient school systems that are, and buildings that are built today or have a wide range of hazards that we have to deal with, including things such as a threat from active shooters and environmental threats and man-made threats. So I would encourage us to continue to engage with our local code officials and work with them to build more resilient schools. And think of an option like that. What would we need to do to build a more resilient building to better prepare and protect our children in the event of a shelter-in-place activity?
Mr. Chairman, you've been generous with the time. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Next, we will hear from the gentleman from Texas as well, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. One of the reasons I sought to join this committee was because of my district. It's in Houston. My district was devastated by Hurricane Harvey. Homes, businesses, lives were lost, of course. The severity of this storm has been mentioned in multiple opening statements, and I appreciate the focus on it. Although we may disagree on this figure of 38%, that it is 38% worse because of climate change. That number is based on a computer model, not the scientific method, but it doesn't really matter. What we do agree on is that it was disastrous. Harvey wasn't the first major flood we've had in Houston either, because another thing we can agree on is that we've been experiencing these for literally hundreds of years. Between our founding in 1836 and 1936, Houston experienced 16 major floods, some of these cresting to more than 40 feet above the bayou. I got a printout here, actually. It's by the Harris County Flood Control District. It's 11 pages worth, since 1836, 11 pages worth of major flooding. It is Houston, after all. We're built on a bayou. We have clay for ground. Water doesn't flow out of it very easily. It's flat ground. So we understand how important this is, more so than a lot of cities. In 1900, a deadly hurricane wiped out what was then the major regional city, Galveston. It was the deadliest storm in U.S. history. It killed more than 6,000 people, caused $35 million in damage in 1900, equaling over $1 billion today. And it's actually because of that hurricane that people began moving inland to what is now Houston. That's why Houston went from 44,000 people in 1900 to almost 2 million a century later, and well over 2 million today. Flooding has been a real problem in Houston ever since its founding. And I didn't join this committee to discuss climate change. As was pointed out earlier, that's not even in this committee's jurisdiction. I find it to be a distraction. Because is it a problem? Yeah. Is it happening? I'm not going to debate that. But we're here to discuss disaster mitigation and how we can mitigate flooding in any community and communities around the country. That's what's important. That's what we can address. That's what we can control. And that's what we should be addressing here today. With that, I'll start with Chief Eagleson. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony. You mentioned the benefits of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act and the importance of the new pre- and post-disaster mitigation grants. The DRA created a national public infrastructure pre-disaster mitigation fund to help states take actions to prevent the threat of natural disasters. Just real quick, what are you most focused on in terms of implementation to ensure that FEMA can properly identify worthy investments?
Well, thank you, sir, for the question. I think that our focus should be on looking at the most vulnerable populations and also enforcing the building codes to build more resilient communities is my feeling of where the focus should be. And there's a wide range of communities out there that need this kind of assistance. So where to start with that, I couldn't tell you, but that would be my focus.
Okay. Next question I want to ask is about the state's ability to administer these in a flexible way. The DRA provides flexibility for states to administer their own post-disaster housing strategies. Are there any other areas where more flexibility would be warranted? Essentially what I'm asking is, where does federal government get in your way too much, or is it just about right?
Well, I have been involved in a couple of recoveries from nationally declared disasters, and I think the support that we've got from the state and the federal government was just right. I was a chief at a small community that was devastated by the flood, and I think our integrated response system that was set up back in the 90s worked perfectly to help us recover and get back in shape rather quickly. So I'm not sure exactly how to respond to that at this point because I hadn't had recent activity of a nationally declared disaster, but I would say that we need to focus on the integration between the locality, the state, and the federal government to make sure that that transition is smooth and as less bureaucratic as possible.
Mr. Maney, would you have anything to add to those questions at all in my remaining time?
Congressman, simply that from my time as both a state official working for a governor and as a deputy administrator at FEMA, the partnership, the balance between federal government's support of state and local governments is something that's always been, there's always been an effort to right-size, to get that to work well. I think my experience now in the couple of years outside FEMA, the observation I've made is there seems to be strong partnerships between the current leadership of FEMA and the state and local government leadership. I think that's been my observation of recent months.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. And I think apparently there is a common thread from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Climate change is causing a lot of these disasters to be magnified. And this committee deals with man-made and natural disasters. So I don't think it's, beg to differ with my colleagues, I don't think it's out of line that we are discussing this today. Mr. Manning, let's see, is that everyone? Oh, Ms. Underwood, I'm sorry. The gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This topic is critically important to us in the Illinois 14th District. My community in Northern Illinois is facing increasing threats due to flooding along the Fox River in McHenry County. We must be prepared to respond to the serious safety and economic risks that this flooding poses to the many homes and businesses located along the river. Persistent flooding can delay planting and damage crops, hurting our agriculture industry. And our existing water infrastructure is degrading even faster under these more extreme conditions. Flooding has national security implications as well. Some of our major Air Force and naval bases already experience frequent floods. 3 National Guard armories are located in McHenry County alone. So this issue isn't going away. In fact, researchers suggest that this kind of extreme flooding will be the new normal in our community because of climate change. And some of your testimony did touch on flooding, and I'd like to thank you for including that level of detail. My first question is for Dr. Caldas. You're a climate scientist, and from your professional perspective, can you tell us more about the specific threats that climate change poses to communities like mine in the Midwest?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The main aspect of the impacts inland is the extreme precipitation events that are increasing, not only in frequency, but in intensity. The amount of rain falling in the 1% heaviest events has increased quite a bit in the Midwest, second only to the northeast of the country. So when you look at the main impacts that are already correlated with climate change, the extreme precipitation events is one that we can talk about. And because flooding is the main consequence of extreme precipitation events, as you mentioned, there will be quite a bit more flooding in the area of your state. However, we must not focus only on the physical impacts, right? This is a committee on preparedness and response. So when we talk about these disasters, we have to talk about people. Mm-hmm. And people are going to be exposed not only to the physical impacts of these extreme events, the rain itself, the flooding itself, but also the psychological impacts, the social impacts, and everything that comes with a flood. Their house may not be flooded, but their place of work may. The school of their children may. They may lose their wages because they cannot go to work. They have psychological impacts because they get flooded over and over again. And I can yield to Mr. Manning here to talk about repetitive losses if places get inundated over and over and over again. Not only the mental impact is very big, but also the impact on the preparedness. So I would say that extreme precipitation events and flooding are number one.
Yep, and we're seeing that even in our neighboring state of Iowa. So much of that state has had catastrophic floods over the last month or so, and it could happen anywhere, and it's happening more frequently.
And if I may, this last flooding event, it was not even extreme precipitation event, it was more of a perfect storm, because there was record-breaking snowfall. which was because there is a lot more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that's extreme precipitation in the form of snow, not rain. So all that snow was there, and when the rain came down on the snow and melted with the frozen ground, there was nowhere for the water to go
That's
but to
right.
the river, and all blocked up.
Yep. And so what can we expect to see in the Great Lakes region in the next 5 or 10 or 20 years? What do you think? Dr. Collins?
You're asking him?
No, you.
I unfortunately don't have a lot of specific details on
Okay.
the Great Lakes. It is a very important region, of course, fresh water and everything. And I have heard several people saying that it's going to be one of the regions that's going to be focus of a lot of migration.
Thank you. Floodwaters, of course, don't just go away right after a flood. Communities can remain underwater for days or weeks, like we just discussed. So, Ms. Truesdale, can you discuss the public health consequences of standing water after a flood, and how are kids particularly vulnerable to these consequences?
Thank you for the question. Floodwaters obviously pose a severe drowning risk for children. They are among the most likely to drown in a flood. It also can pose electrical hazards when there's downed power lines. It can mix with raw sewage and toxic chemicals and then leave behind residues that can contaminate children's belongings. Children with open wounds can come into contact and also be infected. And then the retreat of floodwaters obviously leaves behind mosquito breeding habitats, which can spread the vector-borne diseases such as Zika and dengue. And of course, children, because their immune systems are still developing, they're potentially at greater risk from harm from these infectious illnesses.
Thank you. Well, you wrote in your testimony that children remain an afterthought in preparedness, response, and recovery measures during these natural disasters. And I know that our committee is committed to making sure that they are no longer an afterthought moving forward. Thank you so much for all of your work and for appearing here today. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. We probably have a little time to ask another round if you have time. But let me say that the issue around climate change and whether this is the proper jurisdiction, was going to get into that a little deeper, but I'll accept that everyone's entitled to their opinion. Mr. Manning, can you explain to this committee why fighting climate change matters in our efforts to stop terrorism?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Similar to the conversations we've been having about the domestic impacts of changing growing patterns, of weather patterns, flooding, that is an impact that's happening globally. And we have seen, currently there are conflicts in North and East Africa that are largely climate-driven, where there's conflicts between pastoral herders and agrarian farmers for resource conflicts. We're seeing, I think there is a potential future where there are growing resource conflicts. Access to clean drinking water, access to grazing lands, growing lands. As you increase conflict, you have instability in nations, you have radicalization, you have all of the ingredients necessary that we have seen historically that lead towards radicalization and terrorism. There's some argument that the Syrian conflict has roots in resource conflicts, climate-driven resource conflicts, and it's no secret to anybody the impacts on our national security from the growth of IS in the Syrian region. So there is most definitely a link, a concern going forward with a changing climate, what that changing climate has on societies worldwide, and the potential conflicts that can be driven by access to resources as a result of those changes.
Thank you. Ms. Truesdale, a lot of my work has been around vulnerable populations, since becoming a member of this subcommittee, ranking member, and now chairman. So that is something, children in vulnerable populations has been one of my main focuses. As a matter of fact, I was fortunate enough to pass the Class Act of 2019 last week, which deals with active shooters. And we know what that devastation has been to our young people across the country, as well as other populations. Can you discuss any inequities in disaster recovery in children? Are we seeing worse outcomes in poor minority children after a disaster?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Payne. Unfortunately, disaster aid tends to favor wealthy Americans and white Americans and homeowners because they have relatively good jobs and higher incomes. They are able to have some flexibility when they are in the recovery period searching for new places to live, when they are able to better navigate the bureaucracy in order to access aid, and they usually have a stronger social network, so they are able to have the help finding new jobs and places to stay. Because of this, they tend to do better than families with the lower incomes and from communities of color. And this exacerbates the existing economic and social inequities that exist. And this obviously then persists with the inequalities we see and the health disparities that we're seeing among children as well. It's just an unfortunate circumstance, and that we need to really address the issues that what may appear on surface as equitable treatment in the cases of disaster aid doesn't necessarily result in equitable benefits. And this just means that our children from more vulnerable and under-resourced communities end up in worse positions than they started, and exacerbates their health.
Thank you. And, you know, I stay committed to raising these issues on a national level in order that there is some equity for all Americans in disaster times. We've seen what Katrina did. We saw what Harvey did. You know, people of lesser means suffered magnificently, incredibly. So I will continue to raise those issues, and I will recognize the gentlelady from Illinois once again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment on the scope, climate change and its role in this committee. You know, FEMA did include climate change in its strategic plan over a number of years as a considerable threat to our country and our ongoing national security, and including while Mr. Manning was at the agency, included climate change and which was important to allow the agency to plan forward. And so this subcommittee, which does deal with emergency preparedness, response, and recovery, must recognize the totality of the threats facing our nation in order for those most vulnerable Americans to have a chance at survival during a disaster. It's critically important, sir, and I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing today. I'm a nurse. I don't know that if you all knew that. And as health providers, we're trained in a number of areas. During my training, there wasn't necessarily a specific focus on disaster medicine, and I know that that's the case for a variety of health professionals, but we do know that the care that folks receive after an emergency or after a disaster is critically important. So I wanted to speak a little bit about these training needs. Ms. Truesdale, do you know, or can you speak about the level of training that providers receive in order to identify and treat post-disaster medical issues, both for children and those around them? And then do we need to provide more professional training for medical response after disaster? If you could just provide some comments there.
Thank you for the question. I can't speak to the level of training that healthcare professionals currently receive regarding disaster response. I can speak to the fact that we need climate change and environmental health curricula in medical schools and nursing schools, and it's an important component of public health, schools of public health as well. All in the medical field need to understand and the underlying issues of pediatric environmental health and how children have unique vulnerabilities so that they can better anticipate their needs in a disaster, plan for them, and then be able to respond. And it's not just the immediate responses that are necessary, whether it's the physical trauma or the emotional health issues, but it's following them up afterwards and making sure that these children aren't, say a child with asthma isn't returning home to a home that's filled with mold or that has a leaky roof, and that children aren't returning to schools that have toxic residues left over from a flooding cleanup that wasn't done correctly. So it's really important that all medical and nursing professionals have a basic understanding of how children are not just like adults, but uniquely vulnerable.
Thank you. Did anyone else on the panel want to comment on that health professional training?
Congressman, I would just like to jump in to suggest that we always could use more training. In my experience, one of the roles I played at FEMA was overseeing the nation's training and education for Homeland Security, the whole Homeland Security mission, the emergency management part of that. The department trained millions of first responders a year, and while I'm very proud of that, it's never enough. There is always more. There's always more that can be done. We will become a stronger nation and a stronger community with stronger first responders, but also general practitioners and neighbors that know more about how to help each other in emergencies. So I would fully support that.
Thank you. And with that, I'll yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony today. It's been invaluable. And we like to thank all of you for your valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days without objection. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.